I was asked to speak at this meeting in order to present the Palestinian perspective on this. And I'm very grateful that I was invited to do that, because I'm not sure if anybody else has the same sense that I do, but I think one of the voices that has been absent from this discussion is really the Palestinian voice. So what I want to do in the time that I have is, first of all, just put this sort of anti-Semitism campaign being waged in this country into context, and highlight the fact that this is really a campaign that's spearheaded by Israel and has been going on for several years. I then want to examine why Israel is pursuing this campaign at all, and why it's pursuing it so vociferously at this moment in time. And then I want to look at what are the effects of this campaign. If it's successful, what would be the effects of it on Palestinian advocacy and on the pursuit of Palestinian rights. And I'll conclude that it will have a very negative and pernicious effect on Palestinians' ability to advocate for their own rights. And for that reason, it should really be opposed. So let's start by looking at this in its Israeli context. As I've said, I think this is essentially an Israeli state-spearheaded campaign, and it's been going on for many years. The assertion is that criticizing Israel, and in particular anti-Zionism, questioning the so-called right of Israel to exist, is inherently anti-Semitic, right? That's the assertion that is made. And I think that this assertion emerged really prominently in Israeli political discourse in around 2001. There was a UN conference in Durban, an anti-racism conference, in which there were discussions held about whether Zionism constituted a form of racism. And although no resolution to that effect was passed, Israel reacted to that conference by forming a body called the Coordination Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism. And that was a body to monitor anti-Semitism worldwide. And what it did is that it explicitly defined anti-Zionism as a form of so-called new anti-Semitism. And since that time, we've seen that assertion all over, Israeli propaganda. It's said by Israeli government officials. It's all over the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. You have Netanyahu, for example, making it central to his 2014 speech to the UN General Assembly. You have Mark Regev, Israel's new ambassador to the UK, on the Andrew Marr show on the 1st of May, which is when this whole thing erupted in the Labour Party. Making that same claim. And in his words, he said, today, modern anti-Semites target the collective Jew, the Jewish state. Okay, so that's the assertion. The question is, why is Israel pursuing this campaign? And perhaps it's kind of obvious to many people, but I think it's worth stating it explicitly. I see this really as Israel trying to silence any kind of debate or discussion about its legitimacy as a state, first and foremost. This isn't just about fear of criticism of its policies. This is really about a fear of people starting to question Israel's basic legitimacy. And I say that because I think it flows kind of logically from this conflation that's being made between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So what I mean is you have Zionism as the founding ideology of the state of Israel, and basically asserts Jews have a right to self-determination through the formation of a Jewish state, right? So a state that is ethnically purely Jewish or majority Jewish in Palestine. If you're an anti-Zionist, you disagree with some or all of that formula, and you therefore challenge the very basis upon which the state of Israel exists in its current form. So what Israel says is, you can't express anti-Zionist ideas, because to do so is a kind of prohibited hate speech, as an anti-Semitism, and that way you stop people from expressing anti-Zionist ideas. So you stop them questioning Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state. So I think that's the kind of conceptual sort of basis of the campaign. The next question is, why is this campaign being fought by Israel so vociferously now? And why has it been so much at the forefront in the last few years? And I think that really stems from various developments that have taken place on the ground, which have caused Israel to have a sense that it is kind of experiencing a crisis of legitimacy in international world opinion, and also to fear that the Jewish state project, so that its ability to maintain itself as a Jewish state is increasingly under threat. So what are these developments? I think first and foremost, many of you will be aware of a big increase in civil society activism in Palestine. And at the forefront of that is the boycotts, divestments and sanctions movement. Okay, so BDS, doesn't, as the allegation has been made, it doesn't call for Israel to be wiped off the map. It doesn't call for Jews to be thrown into the sea. But what it does do is indirectly, in a sense, call into question Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state. And it only does that because it puts at the forefront of its demands several Palestinian rights, which are internationally recognized. These are rights that are enshrined in international law. The right of return of Palestinian refugees who were expelled to Israel proper, and the right of full equality of Palestinian citizens of Israel. But the fulfillment of those rights does, in a sense, challenge the Jewish character of the state. It makes it more difficult for Israel to maintain itself as a majority Jewish state or as a state that privileges Jews. So in that way, I think BDS indirectly calls into question Israel's legitimacy, but it doesn't do that because it's anti-Semitic. It does that because that's just a sort of a fact of the conflict of rights and aspirations that exists here. So that's the first development, is I think the increase in BDS, the success of BDS in the last 2 years. The second development, I think, is the reality really on the ground of Israeli colonization of the West Bank, of the failure of talks to bring about a two-state solution, so that what you have is more and more people realizing that the two-state solution is increasingly unattainable and starting to speak about alternatives, like a binational state, a one democratic state, a civil rights movement in the occupied Palestinian territory for voting rights in Israel, and so on. And you hear it, I mean, even some Israeli politicians kind of say, we better get on with this two-state thing because otherwise we'll have a binational state, And so there's that, of course, were it to happen, clearly challenges the existence of a majority Jewish state in Greater Israel or Palestine, or whatever you want to call it. And finally, I think that Palestinian citizens of Israel have also become much more assertive in demanding their rights to equality in the last 2 years. They've become better organized, more mobilized, more politicized generally. And once again, that fact, that demand for full equality, were it realized, would again challenge a Jewish character of the state, in the sense that it would remove the system of Jewish privilege that exists inside Israel. So all of these developments, I think, have kind of culminated in a sense of panic in Israel about the lack of acceptance of this so-called Jewish state, and the sense that it is becoming increasingly difficult and will become increasingly difficult for Israel to maintain a Jewish state. And as a result, Israel's done two things in reaction to that kind of feeling of panic. The first is it's made various moves to try to entrench its Jewish character. So, for example, there's a bill that was proposed in the Israeli parliament in 2011, which is yet to become a law, which would explicitly define Israel as a nation state of the Jews alone. There's been a demand on Palestinians in negotiations since at least 2009 that they have to explicitly recognize Israel as a Jewish state. There's been all of this talk, even Israeli mainstream politicians talk of the Palestinian citizens of Israel as a demographic threat. They advocate their transfer outside of Israel. So there's that, and then there's this campaign of trying to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in order to silence the debate about and criticism of the nature and legitimacy of the Israeli state and world public opinion. Okay, so I hope that that's clear up until now. What I want to spend the rest of my speech addressing are what the effects of this campaign would be if it was successful on Palestinian advocacy and Palestinian rights. So as a starting point, I'm assuming that most people here know quite a lot about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the effect Israel has had on the Palestinians. Am I right in assuming that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I won't go into it in much detail, but just let's remember as our starting point that Israel's establishment as a Jewish state and its policies the policies it's enacted in order to maintain itself as a Jewish state have been incredibly detrimental to Palestinian rights, have been nothing short of basically catastrophic for the Palestinian people. And you will be familiar with these policies, but they include, of course, expelling almost 1 million Palestinians when Israel was established, appropriating vast amounts of Palestinian land, destroying hundreds of Palestinian villages in order to make way for Jewish settlers. Israel's policy of refusing to allow the expelled Palestinians to return has created the longest and most enduring refugee problem in the world. We know, of course, all about the illegal Israeli colonies all over the West Bank, about the longest occupation, I think probably in modern history, that Israel has been maintaining over the West Bank and Gaza, and a regime of severe racial discrimination that Israel maintains both within its borders, in which the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the ones, in other words, who remained and weren't expelled, are treated as second-class citizens, and an even more blatant kind of system of racial discrimination in the West Bank, which probably amounts to a form of apartheid. So the point I'm making here is that policies and practices that are integral to Israel maintaining itself as a Jewish state are, for the most part, both illegal and responsible for causing very much suffering for the Palestinians and a denial of their fundamental rights. And I think that the reality is there is this contradiction as a result between the Zionist aspiration for there to be an ethnically Jewish state in Palestine and Palestinian fundamental rights. You basically, you can't have both. Something has to give, and up until now, the Jewish state project has been relatively successful, but what has happened is Palestinian rights have been completely violated. So that's the starting point for us to examine what would happen to Palestinian advocacy if this campaign of labeling all anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism were to succeed. And I see that as being really two main consequences, two major implications. The first is, so because Palestinian advocacy of rights that challenge Israel's nature as a Jewish state would be considered a form of anti-Semitism, that's basically the assertion that's made. This means that Palestinians wouldn't be allowed to demand, for example, the right of return of Palestinians to what is now Israel, or full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, because if those rights are realized, they make it difficult for Israel to be a Jewish state, and the logic says, well, then that's therefore anti-Semitic. And it sounds absurd, but I've actually had this said to me by a spokesperson of the Israeli embassy. He said, demanding the right of return, this is anti-Semitism. And the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs on its website describes the right of return under its webpage on anti-Semitism. Okay, so in other words, basically, Palestinians wouldn't be allowed to demand their full range of rights. There are some things that are just out of bounds. The second major sort of implication, I think, is that if you say that opposing Zionism is anti-Semitic, that means that opposing policies which are central to the Zionist project is also necessarily anti-Semitic. So, for example, Palestinians wouldn't be allowed to oppose Israel's discriminatory nationality laws. Okay, these are laws that say that Jews anywhere in the world can emigrate to Israel and automatically acquire citizenship, which is a central feature of Zionism, whilst Palestinians are denied parallel rights. Apparently opposing a policy like that, which is central to Zionism, is essentially opposing Zionism and is therefore anti-Semitism. So what would be left for Palestinian advocacy? I guess Palestinians would be limited only to being able to challenge Israeli practices and policies that aren't inevitably a consequence of Zionism or aren't kind of central to Zionism. So, for example, we could look at some isolated practices like how the Israeli army treats children in the West Bank, and which is very important and it must be highlighted, but it's hardly central to the Palestinian cause. I think, in order for Palestinians to be able to really articulate the full scope of their cause and the full scope of their rights, they need to be able not just to criticize isolated policies here and there, but to oppose the ideology that is the organizing principle behind those policies, that is the ideology that drives these oppressive practices. So the point I'm really trying to make, what I'm trying to say is that the purpose of this anti-Semitism campaign and its effect, if it's successful, is really to inhibit Palestinian advocacy, and it's to inhibit the ability of Palestinians to seek their basic rights. So if unopposed, that is where it leads to. It leads to a situation which would be very detrimental to the Palestinian cause. So what I want to say in conclusion, because I'm sure I'm pretty much out of time, is that if you do want to support the Palestinians, if you believe in Palestinian rights, and if you believe in kind of universal notions like equality and human rights for all, then you have to be firm in opposing this dangerous campaign that attempts to silence all opposition to Zionism. Thank you.